With enormous volumes of quantitative easing being undertaken worldwide, government deficits soaring and national debts rising, some have rightly been questioning the value of our currencies. Today we investigate 10 developed economies and their potential risks of currency crises. So let's dive on in. Now, this channel provides global macro insights for informed investing, so do consider subscribing. Now, currency crises are really nasty. They immediately feed a massive increase in inflation as foreign good prices rise, and this devastates household purchasing power. Just look what has happened to the value of the Argentine peso over the course of the last 5 years, where it has crashed from a value of 9 pesos per US dollar to 68 pesos. The impact has been devastating, with inflation hitting 55% in 2019. Meanwhile, the imposition of capital controls restricting the conversion of Argentine pesos has caused a black market for the greenback, where it takes up to 138 pesos to buy each US dollar, according to tweets by Manuel Aroz. So how can we assess a country's vulnerability to currency crises, given that developed economies run floating exchange rates? Well, firstly, there's the extent that the central banks are increasing the actual supply of currency via their quantitative easing programs. Secondly, there's the increase in the fiscal deficit, which of course will be added to our third factor, national debt as a percentage of GDP. Fourth, there's the current account deficit, which measures the balance of trade in goods, services, investment incomes and transfer payments. Now, a current account deficit represents a consumer nation reliant upon the kindness of strangers, as former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, said. But it is ultimately financed from borrowing from overseas. A high current account deficit can indicate an overvalued currency and a lack of competitiveness of the export industries of that country. So by taking each of these macro indicators and considering the value against the size of the economy, that is the country's GDP, we can determine who is most and least vulnerable to a potential currency crisis. To make this even more accurate, JP Morgan use a weighted score where a 1/3 weighting is placed upon QE, a further 1/3 on the actual size of the current account deficit as a percentage of GDP, and a 1/6 weighting for the fiscal deficit and the national debt. Therefore, these aren't subjective rankings, but are actually based upon relative economic indicators. So starting with the least vulnerable countries, number 10 is Norway, with a healthy current account surplus, no QE program in place, a fiscal budget surplus and a national debt of around 40%. They are one of the least vulnerable to an all-out currency crisis. Number 9 is Switzerland, with a healthy current account surplus, an unwillingness to actually adopt quantitative easing measures, and a healthy fiscal surplus and a national debt of around 41%. The Swiss franc is a relative safe haven among fiat currencies. Number 8 is the Swedish krona. Despite having reintroduced their QE program, Sweden has a healthy current account surplus, low government debt at around 35% of GDP, and a balanced fiscal budget. Number 7 is the Aussie dollar, with a current account surplus, a small fiscal deficit and national debt at around 45% of GDP. The Aussie is far less vulnerable than other countries. Meanwhile, Australia has adopted a relatively modest QE program. Number 6 is the Japanese yen. Now, this at first may give you pause for thought, given the sheer scale of national debt and the ongoing fiscal deficit. But remember, our indicators are more heavily focused upon the size of the QE program and the current account financing, highlighting a potentially overvalued currency. While Japan's QE infinity programs continues, it does so at a more modest rate than that of other countries. Meanwhile, Japan continues to maintain a positive current account balance, suggesting export competitiveness. Number 5 is the Kiwi dollar. While the fiscal position remains strong with a budget surplus and a relatively small level of national debt, we have some concerns regarding the current account position and the large relative size of the QE program. Number 4, it's the euro. With a long-term QE program in place which scores maximum negative marks and scoring 6s for its combined fiscal budget and national debt position, we clearly have some concerns here. But the rich Northern European countries have excelled in their ability to run current account surpluses. Our top 3 starts with the Canadian dollar. Now, Canada scores poorly on the fiscal deficit and the size of national debt, around 90% of GDP, but it also runs a current account deficit and has a decent size QE program in place. Our number 2 spot goes to the US. Its quantitative easing program gives it a 7 out of 10, while its fiscal deficit scores a 10 out of 10, which is well complemented by the size of the large national debt, scoring 9 out of 10. Meanwhile, the US continues to present a persistent current account deficit due to the strength of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. However, as I'm sure you're already aware, the US gets a pass on its foreign exchange vulnerability, given that its global reserve currency requires them to actually run a current account deficit due to the strength of the currency. The enormous dollar-denominated debt that exists globally will help to ensure that the US dollar continues to actually rise against all countries globally, but at a faster rate against some rather than others. So who has the top spot, the most undesirable position among developed economy currencies? Well, tragically, it's the pound sterling. Just over 100 years ago, the pound was transacted in gold sovereigns, where one sovereign equaled each pound. At today's prices, a gold sovereign will cost somewhere around £370. Such is the depreciation of our currencies against gold. The scale of the QE program attains an 8 out of 10, yet the size of the UK's current account deficits highlights a currency which may well be considerably overvalued, even at its current weak levels. There's little doubt about it, we are going to see enormous exchange rate vulnerability among many less economically developed countries, many developing countries, and we are going to see numerous exchange rate pegs break. This is also posing some stresses for the longest standing exchange rate peg, which is the US dollar to the Hong Kong dollar, which has stood since 1982. Can this last? Well, there's speculators that are betting on this actually breaking. Now, the lessons from all countries that have experienced currency depreciations is clear. Hard currency, hard assets, and as our friends from Argentina, Lebanon, Zimbabwe and Venezuela show us, that Bitcoin also has a considerable role to actually play in supporting purchasing power in these countries. Please do consider subscribing and do share and like this video. Thanks ever so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.